Dr. Canizaro, I want to thank you for joining us today to about the research that you've conducted with the Progressive Ideas grant. You are the executive director of the Pennsylvania Economy League. Could you talk a little bit about how you got into that position and what the Pennsylvania Economy League does?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me, and thank you for supporting our research. The Pennsylvania Economy League is a local government think tank. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that provides technical assistance to municipalities across the state, of all sizes and all municipal types. We are our main goal is to help municipalities provide as many services as they can at the best cost to the taxpayers, and really help them find the best policy choices that they can to avert either economic hardship for the governments and the municipalities, or try and work towards getting them out of any bad financial shape that they might currently be in. Um, you know, it is, every time it comes up with local government, I always like to say the federal government is obviously very important, state government is very important, but local, at least for me, is where you have the most direct and impactful effects that are immediate for residents. And it's the place where so much can get done. It provides just a unique opportunity to really have some direct community engagement, understand the issues, challenges, innovations that are occurring on the ground, and find good solutions to them that can move us forward and really support the well-being of communities and residents.
Yeah, absolutely. Local policy is really where the rubber meets the road,
It
right?
really is.
So the research that we're talking about today was looking at the effect of tax exempt properties on
Yeah.
municipalities in Pennsylvania. So, can you just kind of set the stage? What are tax exempt properties and why is anybody tax exempt?
Yeah, so there's so many. And this is not something unique to Pennsylvania, but it under the IRS codes, tax exempt organizations provide charitable good to the wider community and the residents and people in the US in general, or abroad as the case may be. But for us in particular, um, the tax exempt properties that we were really thinking about and dealing with are properties and buildings and open space that's owned by government entities, either state, federal, or local, or authorities, or whatever the case may be, school districts, and nonprofit organizations. That is folks that provide direct services, but also hospitals and colleges and universities, really, organizations and individuals that are here to support the greater good, and for good reason. Nonprofits provide vital services to the communities that they work in, and they're necessary for communities to thrive and sustain themselves. From a theoretical perspective, nonprofits are there because there's a market failure and then potentially a government failure, and nonprofits come in to support communities and residents in meeting the totality of needs. So, in no way should this research be seen as a critique on nonprofits. As running a nonprofit, I understand and appreciate the impact that our organizations provide. But it's always good to take a step back and think about what some of those unintended consequences of good things might be.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads me to my next question. So, you were interested in the impacts
Yeah.
at the municipal level of nonprofits. So, what kind of impacts were you looking for?
Yeah, I'm gonna start with just a baseline understanding. For years, so I should before I started at the Economy League, I was a faculty member at a local college and ran a policy institute there. And for years, we would have community members come and say, "What's going on? How many nonprofits are there? What does that impact?" And no one knew. We could say, well, that's a big institution and maybe they should be paying, more and supporting the community, but there were no hard numbers behind it. So really, for me, the big question was how do we create or find a reliable and standardized data set? Of information to inform the conversation.
Mhm.
I don't know if I had any policy outcomes in mind, or trying to move towards a certain angle, but knowing that it just wasn't there to begin with and being able to contribute to that larger idea set has been really impactful. And the work across the state, local governments, other nonprofits and associations, community organizations have come to me asking about the research because they see what those direct impacts are on their own communities. And it allows them to put some actual hard numbers and data and evidence behind just those feelings. And that's for policy work in general. That's what I always advocate for, when I'm talking with my students or whoever else. I don't want us to make decisions just on how we're feeling at the
Mhm.
moment, but what are the numbers telling us, and what are the actual impacts, and where should we go based on the evidence and the data, as opposed to I think that XYZ is happening or XYZ should actually occur. So that was really what that big impetus is, was just providing that broader depth of information that can help inform other conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Super important. So really the motivation was, okay, we've got nonprofits, we understand that they're a vital part of the community, but in not collecting taxes from them, right, we're foregoing a revenue stream. And
Yeah,
so let's get our arms around exactly what's happening there.
right, right.
So you mentioned that, the data were lacking prior to this work. So can you talk a little bit about the data that you've compiled and also just the
Yeah.
research methodology that you're
Yeah,
using?
absolutely. Yeah. So it's hard, and I'll I'll start there. With all good research questions, it probably isn't going to be a straightforward, easy process to get from formulating a question to some type of end result. I worked with some folks that are associated with the Pennsylvania Economy League, and elected officials to try and get a hold of this data. So we work through state agencies, STEP in particular, to begin to collect and aggregate the information. But Pennsylvania is a unique beast in itself, and that we're a very disaggregated community and a disaggregated state. Every county does things their own way. Municipalities tend to want to have their independence, and it creates a bit of a mismatch when you're trying to do large data work because you need to go to everyone independently. So we took a good number of months just collecting data and trying to figure out, what is the total value of properties in every municipality across the state. It's a little easier to get the assessed values. For properties that are taxed, but it was a big hurdle to then look at the tax exempt status. And that's really because if we're not collecting taxes on it, there's not as much of a drive to collect that information on what is going on with those particular tax exempt properties. So after collecting the data from the assessed side and tax property and the assessed side of the tax exempt properties, we then had to then build out, well, what does this actually mean? I know in the report, and this is something that we have conversations around all the time, is the assessed values versus the market value of properties throughout Pennsylvania. We tax based on the assessed values, but in some counties, assessments are very old. I know I wrote about Lackawanna County up in the Northeast. Their last assessment was in the 1960s. So it's, 60, 70 plus years old at this point. And if I'm remembering correctly, the average assessed value is about $8,000. You can't go very many places throughout the state and get a house or a building for $8,000. And it's meaningful and it's impactful. So using with all of that in mind, we take the common level ratio, which is a way to try and standardize assessed values to a market value that can be compared across counties to create this finalized idea of what is the total value in Pennsylvania, and what is the total value in each municipality. Um, and it's a lot, right? There's a lot of property. There's a lot of tax exempt property. And it's then taking that big aggregate number and being able to break it down and say, in this municipality, here's what's going on. In this county, here's what's going on, to try and gain a bit more insight and information for the state.
Sounds like a Herculean effort.
It was a lot.
And assessments dating to the 60s. Wow. I can't say I'm surprised. We do see
Yeah.
that sort of thing in a number of places, but
And it's not that way everywhere. So
um,
so I'm in Harrisburg, I'm in Dauphin County, and our last assessment was in, I think, the mid 2000s. So some places do it a bit more frequently than others, but it's a big political beast, and it's because of the property taxes. It is a political, I don't know. It's
hot potato.
politician. Yeah, they don't want to touch it, and understandably, right? No one wants to necessarily raise property taxes. But when we are dealing with such old numbers, it doesn't provide the needed resources that governments need to provide the services for their residents. And I know we will get into all of that, but it's a big black box when you think about assessment data because it's just not at the point where we necessarily need it right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So turning now to your findings.
Yeah,
So recognizing, some of these inherent, hurdles that you had to get over. How much tax exempt property did you find in the state, and
yeah,
how is it distributed within different municipalities, counties,
yeah.
sort of in that way?
So overall, it exceeds $141 billion in market value. So that is, if I was going to go out and pay for a building today, this is what we would be paying for that total property. It's a lot. With that being said, it only equals about 20% of the total property value throughout the state as a whole. So it's a significant amount, but there's a lot of tax property also. Think about the methodology. There are still some gaps in the data because a lot of open space is not assessed effectively or assessed at all. So there is probably more out there. It is also that this is the market value and not the assessed value. So if you were going to go and look at assessed values now, that number would be pretty significantly less. But with all of that in mind, I have it pulled up so I can read the numbers off. This Philadelphia, which is Pennsylvania's only first-class city, has over $45 billion in tax-exempt property. Second-class cities, which is second class and second class A, is 13 billion. So those two alone, or those three cities alone, is 58 million or 58 billion. A lot of money. Um, and a lot of folks don't live in, Philly or Pittsburgh and Scranton. They live throughout the rest of the state. So as we begin to cycle down, third class cities is almost $11 billion. First class townships is almost 14. Second class townships is 40 billion, and boroughs is almost $18 billion in tax exempt properties. And it runs the gambit of very small municipalities. We have some that have 50 or 100. I think there's one we worked in relatively recently that has about 180 residents, to some larger towns that have 30, 40,000 cities with, 100, 150,000 residents. So large areas to very small areas, but everyone is impacted by this. And it's really because every community has their own individual needs, and there will be nonprofit organizations and government buildings to meet those needs and provide those services. So no one's immune to tax exempt properties. Everyone is affected or is impacted by it.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a point of clarity, the first class, second class cities, that's not a judgment call. That's a
It
legal
is not.
distinction,
Yes, no,
right?
it is not a judgment call at all. Right. Yeah. So we have first and second class cities, which is based on the size of the city. Philadelphia is our only first class city. Pittsburgh is our only second class city. And then there's a second tier, which is second class A, which is Scranton. Third class cities is everyone else. And again, no judgment call. Allentown, Harrisburg. I lived in the city of York. So, large, important cities that make huge differences. And the same with townships. So we have first and second class townships. It's really just a way for the state to provide a bit more guidance and oversight for the size and the types of communities and what services they must offer and what are some limitations from a tax perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So okay, so everybody has tax exempt properties, which means everybody is foregoing property tax revenues. What are some tools that municipalities, cities, first class, second class, whatever, use in order to either, backfill this financial gap or try to maybe compel or coerce
Yeah,
tax
yeah.
exempt property
You
owners
know,
to do
the
something?
the big one that is used throughout the state are pilots, and that's payment in lieu of taxes. So for tax exempt organizations, they can enter into agreements with their host municipality to pay some portion of what they would have in a tax liability. There is no legal ramification for doing it or not doing it. It's up to any tax exempt organization to enter into those agreements independently. And decide the amount that they are willing to pay or not. I've had conversations with individual municipalities that have some frustration that large nonprofits that I could probably be a little more direct, but some colleges and universities don't pay pilots, and it's fine. There's no judgment call on paying or not paying, but there's large amounts of students that need services that then go unfunded. We've all seen or heard or been at undergrad, and the amount of times fire alarms get pulled in dorm rooms, someone is going to come out, right? It's either going to be the police or some type of public safety, and someone needs to pay for it. And if pilots aren't used, then it's really just a entire expense and burden on those expenses for the municipality, without anything coming back in return to pay for the time and efforts and services and cars or whatever else it may be to meet those needs. And you have to. Right. There is never a time where a local government or a public safety institution would say, well, you don't pay taxes, so, we're not going to put out that fire. Or, we're not going to respond to some type of emergency just because you don't support the government. As a government institution, there is a need to respond to all public goods or all public needs. And regardless of ability to pay or willingness to pay, it will be responded to.
That makes a lot of sense. It's also easy to see how that would be very burdensome from the municipal perspective.
Yeah,
So pilots,
yeah,
obviously not limited to Pennsylvania, also questionable about how
right.
effective they often are because they are voluntary.
Yeah,
So what policy recommendations would you make to municipalities that are thinking, boy, this this equation just isn't working for us? Like what
yeah,
tools might you point out?
yeah. For years, there has been conversations about tax policy in Pennsylvania in general. The Pennsylvania Economy League authored a report with support from the Pennsylvania Municipal League called "It's Not 1965 Anymore," looking at municipal tax policy. And some of the limitations that we have on caps on millage rates for property taxes and EIT, earned income taxes, and a whole range of issues leads to this compounded issue and the compounded impact on municipalities. Um, there's legislation that's currently being discussed at the state level to try and support and provide grants to municipalities to make up for some of the lost revenue. When I was actually writing the final report, I saw that I think it was in this past December, there was legislation introduced to actually do some type of land tax or land value taxation for tax exempt properties. So there's a whole host of issues and concerns and potential policy recommendations. That's important, right? So the total loss in the total tax liability based on these tax exempt properties is close to $1 billion. So it's I think I estimated it at $905 million. Um, that's also an undercount because it's based on assessed values. Um, so there's just so much that needs to be done. And I don't have that crystal ball. It's a big political game to try and understand and work with individual municipalities to figure out what is going to work for them in particular. Um, but regardless, something needs to be done.
Mhm.
It can be trying to enter into pilot agreements with nonprofits. It can be trying to, charge service fees for what is being provided and offered. It could be turning to land value taxes as a pathway to try and retrieve some of these costs. It could be providing grants at the state level. There's just so many different options, but something needs to be discussed either at the municipal level or a conglomeration of municipal leaders need to go to the state to try and figure out what can be done because a continuation year after year of $1 billion laws is hurting municipalities' ability to thrive and survive.
That makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned land value tax, and if you know our organization, which you obviously do, we
Absolutely.
do a
Yeah.
lot with land value tax.
Yep.
So Pennsylvania is the only state where we've got implementations. And I know that tax exempt properties are not, in those places are not paying a split rate
Yeah.
or a land value tax. So can you just, because I think the people who watch this will be like,
Yeah.
wait a minute, talk to me about that. So
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
how would that work and what would need
Yeah.
to change for that to work?
Yeah, we've had a lot of conversations around this, and I've spoken with my team in a good depth about this because you're right. With regardless of if a land value tax is implemented or not, as it stands right now, our tax exempt properties are exempt from paying anything. But I think the argument is not necessarily on the land itself, but what is the purpose of the buildings on that land? So if you have, we in York, there was a hospital that closed down and has been recently turned into apartments. It went from the buildings being used for a public good to now something that is no longer a public good. It's housing. It is that building went from a tax exempt status to now a taxable status as a result of the buildings on that land. It's not the land itself. And a building can be knocked down and something else can be built on top of it, but that land will be there regardless. And that's really, at least from my perspective, what that argument is for a land value tax, because it's the usage of the property, not the land itself, that provides a public good. The caveat to that are parks and community gardens and trails and things where it is the actual land, the beauty of our natural landscape and environment, and being outdoors that is providing some type of public good, but less that it is the buildings that provide the tax exempt status and not the land itself. Um, I'm not a lawyer, so if that holds up with the court system, this is going to be outside of my realm. But at least from a policy perspective, it seems to make sense that there is some type of liability that can go into there. And it goes the opposite way also. So, if there is a home, I moved to Harrisburg relatively recently, and we pay property taxes. If at some point in time our home was turned into, a shelter for people that are going through domestic violence, and maybe the YWCA would own this home, it would become tax exempt. And great, right? We need more domestic violence shelters and places where folks can go in times of crisis and need. It's then the buildings on that property that creates that tax exempt and charitable status, as opposed to the land that it's sitting on.
That makes a lot of sense. And it aligns, with the kind of underlying logic of a land value tax, which is that the value of land is largely created by the community, right? And the
It is,
LVT
yeah.
kind of recoups that for community use.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it feels
And
like a
it could provide greater incentive for nonprofit organizations to go into more disenfranchised communities also. If we are basing the value off of the land itself, being in a high population, high cost urban area may not make sense for that nonprofit and may be able to then provide more um, holistic services in a area that has been disregarded from community economic development activities. And it could potentially also then increase all the value in that area also. If you have a hospital system that is in a urban area and knows that they're going to need to start paying land value taxes, they may move to a more rural area that would benefit a rural community that has not been seen or has had a hospital system in their area for a number of years.
interesting. I could see how that could be both positive and
Absolutely.
perhaps not so positive, right? You
Yeah,
want hospitals in urban areas as well.
sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
It could certainly incentivize though more intense land use,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Very, very interesting exercise in thinking
It
this
is,
through.
isn't it? Yeah.
Yes. So my last question for you is, are you going to continue with research of this type? And if you are, what else are you going to explore?
Yeah, I so right now the data is at the state level. In the report, there's some information at the county level, but I would like to run more, to get into the meat of it, to run the regressions at the county level, because each county is different and unique. York is different than Dauphin, which is different than Lackawanna and Erie and everywhere else. There are center county. Right, there are unique circumstances and demographics that impact each individual county, and being able to better understand what's going on at a more localized level, I think can benefit everyone. Some of the results that I found is, the potential impact of labor force participation rates on the rate of tax exempt properties, or the impact of childhood poverty, and not necessarily causal effects, but there's some marginal effects one way or the other. Being able to say, this has a larger effect here than it does here could inform maybe a bit more policy discussions or policy decisions that would have a more direct impact based on what those localized conditions are. I always advocate and try and get down to the smallest level possible. And I think that's what that next step is. Not just saying, here's everything that's going on, but how does this actually impact individual residents and individual communities?
Circling back to the idea of local, the importance of
That's it.
acting locally.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, that sounds like a very logical and potentially really impactful way to take the research moving forward. So that's great to hear.
Yeah.
All right. right. Well, Dr. Canizaro, thank you so much for joining me today. We really appreciated the opportunity to support this work, and I appreciated the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you. You too. It was a pleasure.